All right, so now that we are recording, I will also just say again, and Molly, I just told you this, but for the recording so everybody else can hear as well. I know a lot of people had trouble with the like the last few questions on the quiz on D2L on Friday. So as long as you got me the answers to the questions, those last few questions somehow, that's totally fine. I'm going to go through and grade them today. We definitely won't be doing that in the future. So I apologize if you guys had some trouble with that. Okay. So today we're going to be going over chapter 12, which is just kind of like an introductory chapter to the diversity of life that we see on the planet. So the next few chapters are going to expand on this. The next chapter that we're going to do on Wednesday is all about microbial diversity. So looking at some single-celled prokaryotic organisms, looking at some of the protists that we see and fungi. And then as we move into chapters 14 and 15 next week and the week after, we'll start talking about plants and animals. So this is going to be just kind of the intro chapter to all of those. And then, we should be able to get through this chapter here today pretty quickly. Okay, so before we jump in and start talking about a few of the things we need to talk about today, this is going to be a little bit of a reminder of things we talked about back in chapter 1. So feels like forever ago, but just want to refresh some people's memories. So when we talk about the levels of classification, it's referred to as like when we name things and group things, this is taxonomy. That's the science of taxonomy. The father of taxonomy is Carl Linnaeus, and he's the one who developed the way that we name species. So we as humans just have this need to organize and name and classify things. And so that's a whole branch of science to do that. And so that is called taxonomy. And we have this binomial nomenclature for naming a species, where we used two names to refer to a specific species, and those two names are two levels of classification, basically, that we put together. So taxonomy uses this hierarchical model, this series of nested groups. So we have really big groups up at the top, and then they get more and more narrow. Each of these are nested within the other. And then this down here is our binomial nomenclature. Our genus and species level classification are what we use to name an organism. So anytime we're writing this, you can see as we're going up this hierarchy here, the only ones that are italicized are the genus and the species. We always italicize those when we are naming an organism, but the rest of these levels of classification don't have to be italicized. And then when we put them together here, italicized, only the genus name is capitalized, the species name is not capitalized. So those are just kind of rules for naming organisms so that everybody universally names them all the same across the world. And this is just another example kind of showing these nested groups. I really like this one because it kind of shows that, down here in this domain, we have multiple nested kingdoms, these green boxes, and within the green box of kingdom, we have multiple phylum that are in there. And as we go up this classification illustration here, we're getting more and more specific. So eventually, as we go through our class, contains a bunch of different orders. The orders contain a bunch of different families. The families contain a bunch of different genera or genuses. And then we have one genus that contains multiple species. So then when we put this genus and this species name together, that allows us to refer to this very specific animal here. So there are lots of just species names, the second part of the name, that are the same within a genus. So that's why we want to make sure that we are referring to both of them so that we're referring to this very specific type of animal or plant. These taxonomic groups are determined, they used to be determined originally just based off of morphology, just how they look. If they look similar, they must be in the same group, they must be somehow related. But now we primarily rely on genetic information to determine these relationships. If you remember, we have two groups of prokaryotes. And so if you're just kind of going based on what these look like, these single-celled prokaryotic organisms, they seem pretty similar. but genetic analysis actually showed that these were completely different groups of prokaryotes, but we didn't know that until we started using some genetic information. So that just happened back in the 1970s. This is a hypothesis that constantly updates, how things are organized. So we just are, the more that we learn, the more we can add information to this hypothesis and adjust it and make it more and more accurate. So when we talk about the diversity of life that we see, all life is coming from a common ancestor, and we can map this common ancestor and this diversity that we see now on something called a phylogenetic tree. Basically just looks like a tree, and it helps show these branching relationships between organisms, what evolved from what, the order in which they evolved. We can all see that on a phylogenetic tree. And then the study of phylogeny, that actual phylogeny is referring to the evolutionary history and relationships of these organisms. And then the study of this is called systematics. So just some definitions to get you going there. This is the phylogenetic tree of all life. So we've got this star over here in the animal group showing where we are. So these 3 branches here are showing our 3 domains. So remember, we have 2 prokaryotic domains and then 1 eukaryotic domain. So you can see that even, we have a wide variety of animals, a big, diversity of animals. We've got a big diversity of plants. We know that, but you can also see that this animal branch and this plant branch are just really small branches of this really big phylogenetic tree. So this is where we are over there in the eukaryotic domain. So this is a slide directly from chapter 1, but I just wanted to touch base on it. So we are refamiliarized with these domains. So we've got 2 prokaryotic unicellular domains. So prokaryote is not a domain. That prokaryote refers to 2 different domains, bacteria and archaea. And we'll talk a little bit about the diversity we see in these on Wednesday. But bacteria, unicellular prokaryotic, archaea, unicellular and prokaryotic. But back in the 1970s, when genetic evidence started coming into the picture, we realized that these are so different from each other. That's why they are different domains on this tree of life. But both prokaryotic, both unicellular. And then I'm going to back up one slide, but if we go back here, when we're talking about that common ancestor, that's going to be right down here on this tree. So this common ancestor of all life doesn't exist anymore, but this ancestor that occurred right here at this branch point is the ancestor that all life evolved from. You can kind of see that at this point, everything starts to branch off. So this right here, this branch point is the common ancestor. And then within our last domain eukarya, we've got 4 kingdoms, and we're going to talk about 2 of these on Wednesday and then kind of break down the other 2 over the next few weeks. On Wednesday, we're going to talk a little bit about fungi. We're going to talk a little bit about protists. And then next week, we'll talk about plants. And then the week after that, we're going to talk about animals. So we're going to go through all of these kingdoms within this eukaryotic domain in the upcoming lectures. And we need to, before we kind of jump into these diversity of life lectures, it's really important for us to understand how to interpret a phylogenetic tree. We're going to be seeing a lot of phylogenetic trees in the diversity chapters. So we want to make sure we're understanding what they look like and what they're saying. So we can read it basically like a map or kind of like a timeline. Anytime we have a point where the tree splits, where we have a branch coming off, that's referred to as a branch point. So we've got a branch point up here, and then this one branches off again. So this phylogenetic tree is just referring to apes. So we've got a branch point where a new lineage evolved. This is the orangutan lineage here. And this is representing a common ancestor that existed in the past but doesn't exist anymore. So that's something that's really important to understand. A lot of people think that humans evolved from chimps, and that's not true. Humans and chimps evolved from a common ancestor. So down here on our tree, at this point, this branch point represents a common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees. Humans evolved from this common ancestor, and chimpanzees evolved from this common ancestor. So our common ancestor doesn't exist anymore, but humans and chimpanzees evolved from that common ancestor that occurred at this branch point. And then when we have two lineages that come from the same branch point, they're called sister taxa. So if we go back to our orangutan example over here, at this branch point, we've got, a single lineage evolving, but then that branches off into two sister taxa. So these two orangutan species are sister taxa. These mountain gorilla species, or these gorilla species, mountain gorilla, lowland gorilla, western gorilla, are all sister species, sister taxa that broke off at this same branch point, this same lineage. Sometimes phylogenetic trees look a little bit like this, which are really helpful for understanding evolutionary change. They show these common traits that species do or don't have. So here we're looking at a variety of like vertebrate species, so different fish or amphibians. So we can see that we have a common ancestor here that had a vertebral, or that didn't have a vertebral column. And then at this branch point here, this is where we get the evolution of a vertebrae and vertebral column. So at the branch point, you can go in two different directions. Do we not have vertebral column? We'll go this way. That's to our species called a lancelet. If we do have a vertebral column, we're going to go this way. And then at this branch point up here, this point represents an evolutionary change of a hinged jaw. Do we have a jaw that hinges? No, we're going to be a lamprey. If we do have it, we're going to go up here. Then we've got another branch point indicating evolutionary change that evolved legs. So at this branch point, we're evolving legs. Did we evolve legs? No. This is a fish. Yes. Then we're going to go up here. So you can kind of follow this phylogenetic tree with these evolution of these different traits. Do they have the trait? Do they not have the trait? Sometimes you're going to get a phylogenetic tree that looks a little bit like that. So when we're building a phylogenetic tree, this is going to be important for us to understand. Like if you are given a group of organisms and given a set of traits, you should be able to kind of construct these evolutionary relationships. And the way that we do that is through cladistics. It organizes organisms into these groups called clades that consists of a common ancestor and all of its descendants. So in this example here, we've got our vertebrates again, but we have this other group that's kind of highlighted in orange over here that refers to organisms that have an amniotic egg. And we're going to talk about amniotic eggs when we get to our animal chapter. But this clade here refers to the common ancestor that had the amniotic egg and all of the descendants, so lizards, rabbits, and humans. So this is a clade right here. And clades, sort of when we talk about those taxonomic groups, those are very specific in what they entail. But a clade can vary in size depending on where you are looking at that common ancestor, right? If we wanted to look at common ancestors that that had, like on the previous slide, we looked at things that had a jaw, right? A lamprey is a jawless fish. A lancelet doesn't have a fish, or it doesn't have a jaw, right? So these two are both jawless. So if we wanted to look at a clade that included things with jaws, we would include this common ancestor that occurred down here. Then we have all of the common ancestor, or all of the descendants of fish, lizards, rabbits, and humans, because all of those things have jaws. So the common ancestor and all of its descendants are going to be that clade. So it can kind of vary in size. And we build this using characteristics. So if you see this, you can kind of see that this side of the cladogram here is kind of like our timeline. And then we get these branches that come up off of that base timeline. Up at the top, we have all of our organisms, and then down at the bottom, this is where we put our characteristics. So here we've got a characteristic right here of the development of an amniotic egg. Whoops. So if we are looking at a characteristic that's found in all members of a group, it's called a shared ancestral characteristic. So all of the members of this group have vertebrae. And if we have a shared derived characteristic, that's something that only some of the organisms on our cladogram have. So anything at the bottom of our cladogram here is going to be our shared ancestral characteristic. Anything that we find up here occurring in between all of these different groups is going to be a shared derived characteristic. Here's an example of this. So it's possible that, after we go through our animal section, that you might need to build something that looks like this, where we have our organisms up at the top and then we have our characteristics down at the bottom. So let's just kind of go through this. Again, this line right here is kind of referring to our timeline. So at the beginning of our timeline, we have a common ancestor that has vertebrae. After the development of vertebrae, we have the branching off of sharks, so our cartilaginous fishes. And then we have a shared derived characteristic of the rest of this clade that refers to organisms with a bony skeleton. So we have the evolution of a bony skeleton here. And so if we are referring to the clade that consists of animals with a bony skeleton, we have this common ancestor that originally evolved it, and then we have all of the members of that clade. So everything except for sharks. And then we have the evolution of a tetrapod, or something with 4 limbs. So this is a shared derived characteristic that everything to the right of this characteristic has, but nothing to the left of this characteristic has it. Okay, this is basically like a point on our timeline that 4 limbs evolved. Everything from here on out is going to have it, but nothing behind us has these 4 limbs. Then we have the development of our amniotic egg. Once we have our amniotic egg developed, we kind of see a split into our mammals and then into our birds and reptiles. So we have a shared derived characteristic for our reptiles and birds, eggs with shells. And then we have a shared derived characteristic for our mammals. We've got the evolution of hair here. So you can see that this characteristic is put up here on this line, indicating that this is the only group that has hair, right? So we could even, we could say that this is just a clade here if we're referring to the common ancestor that evolved hair and then all of its descendants. That could be a clade in and of itself, that group right there. So this sort of mark on our timeline isn't down here on this baseline. It's a little bit above because it's showing that this is the only group that has hair. If there's something that only these groups have, we could put it up here as well, right? Like amphibians have this special type of breathing called cutaneous breathing, where they can actually breathe through their skin. So we could put a little tick on this line up here and say cutaneous breathing, because amphibians are the only thing that have that trait as well. So it's just really important as you're going through the chapter that you understand how to construct these, because we're going to be seeing these a lot as we go through the rest of the diversity chapters here. All right, so I promised today was going to be short, and it is. So that's all that's in this chapter. It's just kind of setting the scene for what we're going to be doing coming up. So that's all we've got for today. I'll go ahead and get the recording stopped. If you have any questions or concerns about the quiz that we took on Friday, feel free to let me know. I'll keep the meeting open for a couple more minutes, but otherwise I will just see you guys on Wednesday.